I can't breathe. Please, I need my daughter. That's what Marcus King begged as Officer Miller slammed him to the ground. His daughter Naya dying in the back seat, her medical emergency ignored. Hours later, Marcus was locked up. No help, no care. He pressed the emergency button over and over until his voice was hoarse. By the time they let him out, his daughter was gone. When they told Marcus that Nia died from an allergic reaction, he didn't scream, he didn't cry, he just stared. Because Marcus wasn't raised to fold. He was built by the streets, trained by loss, disciplined by pain. And when the system failed, Naya, he didn't demand justice, he hunted it down, one cop at a time. Officer Miller, Officer Drake, the DA, they vanished, no notes, no trace. This is the story of how one death led to a chain of vengeance, a chain that would rip through every life that let Nia die. A black father, Marcus King, pulled over for a routine traffic stop on a quiet street. His young daughter Naya sitting in the back seat. The officers, Officer Miller and Officer Drake, approached the car with an air of hostility, their faces cold and indifferent. They didn't care that Marcus was just trying to get his daughter to the hospital. Naya, who had a severe allergy, was already showing signs of distress, her breathing shallow and labored. Marcus pleaded with the officers, explaining that Naya was in the middle of an allergic reaction and needed help immediately. But the cops, clearly unbothered, mocked him, telling him to calm down as if his panic was the problem, not the fact that his daughter was fighting for air. As Marcus grew more desperate, his voice rising in anxiety, Nia's condition worsened. She began to choke, gasping for air, her small hands clutching at her throat. But despite his frantic pleas, Officer Miller refused to let Marcus make the call he so desperately needed to make. "You'll wait until we're done here," Miller sneered, clearly enjoying the power he held. The seconds felt like hours as Marcus fought to keep his composure, trying to reassure Naya that help was coming, even though he knew help wasn't coming from the officers standing in front of him. Body convulsed as she slipped further into anaphylactic shock, her face turning pale and her lips turning blue. Marcus begged again, his voice breaking as he screamed for an ambulance, for anyone to help. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers begrudgingly allowed him to call for help, but by then, it was too late. Naya died in Marcus's arms, her small chest stilling forever as Marcus clutched her lifeless body. The scene cuts to the aftermath of this horrific event. Marcus, devastated and broken, is forced into the back of a squad car, handcuffed, the injustice of it all settling over him like a thick fog. He is taken to the station, his world crashing down, while the officers who caused his daughter's death return to their routine, unaffected and cold. The tragic loss of Naya King becomes the spark that ignites a wave of anger and outrage across the city. A public outcry grows as news of Naya's death spreads, becoming a symbol of police brutality, racial injustice, and the failure of a system that allowed a child to die in the arms of her father while the people who should have helped stood by, indifferent. The protests start, the chants echoing through the streets. Justice for Naya, and Marcus, in his heartbreak, begins to see the only way forward, a path he never thought he'd walk. Marcus's grief slowly morphed into a rage so fierce it burned through him, propelling him forward. He could barely sleep, eat, or think clearly, his mind fixated on the injustice that had stolen his daughter. Naya had been taken from him by a system that cared more about power and control than about saving lives. As the days passed, the fury of a father who had lost everything began to reverberate across the city. It didn't take long before the city's anger found its voice. Protests erupted, spreading like wildfire through the streets. People from every race and background came together, united by one shared belief: Nia deserved to live. The chants of justice for Naya rang out, echoing off the buildings, filling the air with urgency and determination. It wasn't just a protest for one life lost, it was a fight for every person who had suffered under a system of unchecked power and discrimination. The media quickly picked up the story, amplifying the voices of those marching. The protests became larger, more intense, their momentum unstoppable. Marcus's name was whispered across the city, but it was Nia's face, innocent and beautiful, that became the symbol of the fight. News stations covered every step of the protests, from the smaller, quieter gatherings to the increasingly violent confrontations with police. The story of Naya's tragic death was out there now, impossible to ignore. The protests were growing, and Ava, a local activist and community leader, saw an opportunity to push for something bigger. She had spent years organizing smaller rallies, but the scale of this situation felt different. This wasn't just about police brutality, it was about an entire system that had failed Marcus and Nia, and countless others like them. Ava took charge, rallying the protesters with increasing intensity, urging them to escalate their efforts, to demand accountability from those in power. As the protests swelled, a powerful symbol began to take form. Someone had started painting a mural Nia's face on the wall just a few blocks from where she died. The face was full of life, her eyes staring straight ahead with a peaceful strength, her hair flowing like the wind. Beneath it, in bold, powerful letters, the words "She deserved to live" were painted. It was a slap in the face to the system, a reminder that Nia's death wasn't just an accident, it was the result of systemic racism, neglect, and inhumanity. The mural didn't just memorialize Nia, it told the world that she was more than a statistic, more than a footnote in the news cycle. She was a person, with a family, with dreams, with a future taken too soon. The mural quickly became a focal point for the protesters. People from all over the city came to visit, leaving flowers, notes, candles, and personal messages beneath her painted image. The mural became a powerful rallying point for the movement, gaining national attention. News crews lined up every day, broadcasting images of the mural, amplifying the message. It wasn't just about one child, it was about all the children, all the victims, all the families who had been torn apart by a broken system. Social media exploded with posts about Nia, about Marcus, and about the brokenness of a system that had allowed this tragedy to happen. Videos of Nia's final moments leaked online, showing the cold indifference of the officers as Nia's life slipped away. Her last breaths, her father's desperate attempts to save her, all of it was caught on camera. These images, these moments were now out there for the world to see, impossible to ignore. People who had never heard of Nia before now knew her name. They shared her story, felt her pain, and stood with Marcus in his grief. People from all walks of life began to mobilize. The protests grew larger, more widespread. It wasn't just happening downtown, it spread across the suburbs, into small towns, through cities, across the country. The message was clear, the system was broken, and Nia's death was the spark that would ignite change. People weren't just rallying for justice for one girl, they were rallying for every person who had been wronged by a system that failed them. Ava, the activist, used her platform to drive the movement forward. She was everywhere, on TV, on the radio, on social media, pushing for a complete overhaul of the justice system. She wasn't afraid to be loud, to be aggressive. As she organized, she began to shift the protest strategy, calling for direct action, urging the crowd to push harder, demand more. "We're done asking for change," Ava told the crowd during one of the largest marches. "Now we're taking it." The growing momentum of the protests put the authorities on edge. News outlets ran continuous stories about the protests and their escalating tactics. The police started to feel the heat as people began to question their role in Nia's death. The cops were on high alert, knowing they were now under the microscope. Their every action was scrutinized, and the pressure was mounting. Every day it seemed like more and more officers were coming under investigation. More and more fingers pointed toward them. Meanwhile, Marcus's grief turned into something darker, more vengeful. Though he had yet to make his move, he was watching. He was listening. He was quietly gathering information, learning everything he could about the officers responsible. Each death, each action taken by the police, was like a step closer to the reckoning that was inevitable. He wasn't just fighting for justice, he was preparing for the moment when he would make the system feel the pain he'd been living with since the loss of Nia. The suspense around Marcus's next move grew, but so did the public's involvement. The community was no longer just protesting, they were demanding action. People began showing up to police stations, city halls, and courtrooms, demanding accountability. They weren't just waiting for change, they were creating it, pushing it, forcing it into the open. The question wasn't if justice would come, but who would deliver it. Would it be the courts, the politicians, or was Marcus about to take matters into his own hands? After Nia's death, Marcus King's grief began to morph into something else, something colder, more determined. His rage burned deep, consuming everything in its path. But Marcus was not impulsive. He was not someone to lash out recklessly. No, Marcus had learned the value of patience. His mind sharpened, his every thought focused on one thing: revenge. Revenge for Nia. For weeks he went underground. Gone were the public marches and protests. Gone were the cries for justice that echoed through the streets. Now Marcus was a shadow. He became invisible, blending into the city like a ghost. He reached out to old contacts, people from his past, from his time in the military. They knew Him as a quiet, unassuming man until he needed something. Using his military training, Marcus began to track down every officer involved in Naya's death. He studied their routines, their schedules, and their weaknesses. One by one, he identified them. Officer Miller, Officer Drake, and even the less direct players, the ones who had looked the other way, the ones who had failed to stop what happened. Every piece of information he gathered was another step closer to the reckoning that was coming. Marcus wasn't just hunting these officers, he was hunting the corruption that had taken his daughter's life. Marcus's grief had become his fuel, and with each passing day, it consumed him more. The world saw a father grieving for his daughter, but Marcus had transformed. He was no longer just a father, he was a force to be reckoned with, a quiet storm, ready to strike at the heart of the system that had betrayed him and his family. Even as Marcus's resolve hardened, a part of him fought against the path he was walking. He was consumed with the need for justice, yes, but with every step he took towards that goal, he felt a darker side of himself surfacing. Every time he planned to take down one of the cops, he was forced to confront his own soul, his own morality. The weight of his daughter's memory haunted him. Her face, her voice, her laughter, all of it lingered in his mind, urging him forward. But there were moments, fleeting but powerful, when Marcus asked himself, is this what Naya would want? Was this the justice she deserved, or was he just sinking deeper into a cycle of violence and rage? Each time Marcus studied the officers, planned their takedowns, he remembered Nia's innocent eyes and her final, desperate breath. And in those quiet moments, doubt would creep in. Was he becoming the monster that the system had created? The tension between his need for vengeance and his desire to honor his daughter's memory gnawed at him. Would he be able to live with the consequences of his actions, or would the pain of revenge overshadow everything? It was this internal struggle that made Marcus's journey so compelling. It wasn't just about killing the cops, it was about finding his way through the labyrinth of anger, morality, and grief. Meanwhile, in the sterile halls of the county morgue, Dr. Naomi Brooks faced her own personal crisis. Dr. Brooks had been the medical examiner who performed the autopsy on Naya. She had been professional, detached until she opened the file, read the notes, and saw the results for herself. The cause of death was initially listed as cardiac arrest, an explanation that conveniently swept away the deeper truth. But Dr. Brooks knew better. She knew that Naya's death had been entirely preventable, that it had been caused by a lack of medical intervention, denied by the very officers who were supposed to protect her. The truth gnawed at Dr. Brooks like a silent poison. She tried to push it out of her mind, tried to justify the report, tried to convince herself that it wasn't her place to expose the system's failures. After all, the police department was already under pressure from all angles. They wanted things to be quiet. They wanted this to be over. But as Dr. Brooks ran the autopsy through her mind, the pieces didn't fit. She had to do something. The district attorney, Edward Foster, and the police officers put pressure on her to keep quiet, to sign off on the false report and let the narrative stand. They assured her that it was for the greater good, that if she played along, it would all go away. But with every passing day, Dr. Brooks began to feel the weight of her own complicity. The guilt ate away at her from the inside. The realization that she was part of the cover-up, that she was helping to bury the truth, was unbearable. She could no longer ignore what had happened. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when a little girl had died on her watch and no one had even tried to stop it. One night, after hours of tossing and turning in her bed, Dr. Naomi Brooks made a decision. She would reach out, she would contact Marcus. She would try to undo some of the damage she had caused, knowing full well the risks she was taking. She left a cryptic voicemail on Marcus's phone, her voice trembling as she spoke. They're covering it up. They're protecting them. Marcus, they're not going to get punished. They're lying, and so am I. I can't keep living with it. I'm sorry. Her voice cracked as she spoke the words, each one heavier than the last. She knew that reaching out to Marcus was dangerous, that it could cost her everything, but she couldn't keep lying to herself anymore. The truth had to come out, even if it was too late to save Nia. After the voicemail, Dr. Brooks's life became even more fractured. She knew she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. She had become a part of the story now. She was no longer just an observer, she was a player in this twisted game. Dr. Brooks tried to leave town that night, but it was too late. The phone call had been made, and now Marcus knew the truth. The system was not just broken, it was rotten to the core. Her breakdown, the final unraveling of her conscience, marked a turning point. Dr. Brooks had betrayed the truth for so long, but now she was forced to face it. and Marcus was ready to turn that truth into the weapon that would destroy the officers who had killed his daughter. The tension between Marcus and Dr. Brooks heightened as they both spiraled deeper into their respective paths. Marcus's quiet transformation into a predator was contrasted by Dr. Brooks's growing unease, her attempts to reconcile her actions with her professional code. As Marcus drew closer to his goal, each piece of the puzzle falling into place, the stakes became higher. Would Marcus act before he lost himself completely in the shadows? Would Dr. Brooks find the courage to do what was right, or would the pressure break her once again? The slow, creeping build of Marcus's vengeance and Dr. Brooks's breakdown created a sense of mounting inevitability. There was no stopping this, there was no going back. The tension was thick, and each moment felt like it might snap, pulling both Marcus and Dr. Brooks into an uncertain, dangerous future. Marcus had spent weeks meticulously laying the groundwork, silently watching the officers who had destroyed his family. He had studied their every move, their routines, the places they visited after work, the bars they drank at, and even the times they would let their guard down. Every detail had been noted, every flaw calculated. It was now time to act. His first target was Officer Miller, the officer who had cruelly mocked Marcus while his daughter fought for air in the back seat. Marcus had tracked him down to a run-down part of the city, a quiet street where Miller lived in a small, modest home. The air was thick with tension as Marcus watched him through the window, his breath steady and controlled. The strike was swift and silent. Marcus had learned to move like a shadow, undetected, blending into the background. With military precision, he made his way through the house, taking Miller's life in a matter of seconds. The murder was clean, surgical, leaving no trace behind. A quick cut, a quiet struggle, and then silence. The kind of silence that Marcus was beginning to crave, where his grief and anger didn't speak, only his actions did. After the first kill, the other officers involved in Naya's death were left to wonder who was hunting them. Marcus didn't leave a signature, no calling card, no symbol to show who was responsible. He left them to think, to second-guess every step they took. The mystery only added to their fear. They were no longer in control. The system they had relied on was failing them. They were up against an unknown force, someone who knew their weaknesses, someone who was waiting for the right moment to strike. Each death sent shockwaves through the police department, reverberating through the hallways, into the squad rooms, and into the homes of the officers who had taken part in Nia's death. The sense of unease began to spread. It wasn't just one officer dead, it was the beginning of something much bigger, and no one knew who was next. No one knew when the next strike would come, but they all felt it. The fear, the paranoia, the certainty that they were being hunted. As the killings continued, Marcus's ruthlessness grew more evident. He struck at another officer, Officer Drake, this time while Drake was alone in a hotel room just a few days after Miller's death. It was always the same. Marcus would wait, lurking in the shadows, his movements as quiet as the night. The murder was always calculated, precise, without a single mistake, no mess, no trace. Each officer fell the same way, quickly, efficiently, without even realizing what was happening until it was too late. The second officer's death sent a wave of panic through the force. They knew now that whoever was behind the attacks wasn't just playing a game. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was personal. The officers who had been involved in Nia's death started to feel the weight of their actions bearing down on them. They knew they were on a list, but they didn't know who was making the list or why. The suspense began to climb. The department couldn't make sense of the killings. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. It was as though the killer was a ghost, slipping in and out of the night without a trace. Every corner they turned felt like a trap. Every face they saw felt like a potential assassin. And the closer they got to their own homes, the more they felt it. Someone was watching, someone was waiting. Someone who had all the time in the world to plan their next move. Marcus's transformation was becoming clear. He wasn't just a father, seeking revenge anymore. He had become something darker, something more dangerous. His grief had given way to a calm, methodical hunger for justice. A hunger that wouldn't be satisfied until every last officer involved in Naya's death was gone. As the death toll rose, Marcus's meticulous planning was revealed through flashbacks. Each kill, each action was a carefully thought-out move in a much larger game. Through the flashbacks, we saw Marcus's careful observations, the moments when he followed the cops, learning their routines, tracking their habits, finding their weaknesses. He studied how they moved, how they spoke, where they spent their time when the uniform was off. He learned their schedules, the places they felt safe, He learned everything about them, down to the smallest detail. The suspense increased. The officers who had been involved in Nia's death started to feel the walls closing in. Their every move was now shadowed by the unknown. Who was this person hunting them down, and how had they learned so much about their lives? The officers tried to go about their routines, but every time they stepped outside, every time they walked into a dark alley or parked their car, they felt it. The creeping anxiety that made their heart race, the feeling of being watched, the fear among the cops started to grow like a slow cancer. It wasn't just that someone was after them, it was that the person hunting them was always one step ahead. And worse still, there was no obvious connection between the deaths. No pattern to their movements. No obvious signs that would allow the police to predict who would be next. The murders were so clean, so efficient, that it felt like a trap that no one could escape from. Every moment of the day became a game of cat and mouse. But the cops no longer felt like the hunters. They felt like the prey. The tension was unbearable now. Each day that passed without another death only heightened the anticipation. Would the next officer be the one to fall? The fear was eating away at the department. It wasn't just about the deaths anymore, it was about the unknown. The creeping knowledge that they were all being hunted by someone who knew their every move. Someone who could slip in and out of their lives without leaving a trace. And as the murders continued, the city began to feel the tremors of this storm. Marcus was no longer just a father seeking justice, he was a legend. A figure in the dark whose name was whispered in hushed tones. People didn't know who he was, but they knew that he was out there, taking revenge for the injustice done to his daughter. The police department was in turmoil. Every officer, from the rookies to the veterans, could feel the heat. They couldn't afford to make a single mistake, and the more they panicked, the more they made themselves vulnerable. The suspense was unbearable. Every time a cop walked out of their door, they wondered, is today the day I die? And with that uncertainty, plan was moving forward with chilling precision. The stage was set. The question wasn't who would be next, it was how soon the next strike would come. After the second officer fell, the police department finally realized the true gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a series of random murders, it was something methodical, something personal. Someone was hunting them, taking out officers involved in Nia's death, and the police had no idea who was behind it. No fingerprints, no DNA, no witnesses. It was as if the killer was a ghost, slipping through their fingers every time they thought they were close. A task force was assembled, with Detective Lance Rhodes leading the investigation. Rhodes had been with the department for over 20 years, seen it all: violent crimes, gang wars, drug busts. But this was different. The cases were cold from the start. Each officer's death seemed to occur in a vacuum, leaving no clues behind, no patterns, no motives, just a list of victims and an increasing sense of dread among those who remained. Rhodes and his team started chasing leads, hoping for a break, but they quickly realized that they were chasing shadows. Every theory they explored came up empty. A supposed witness would turn out to be unreliable. Surveillance footage would either be missing or corrupted. There was no trail to follow, just a string of perfectly executed murders. As the body count rose, the department's paranoia began to seep into every conversation. The remaining officers, those who had been involved in the incident, started locking their doors at night. They checked their cars, their homes, even the small things: curtains drawn, lights off, peeking out the window before they stepped outside. They had become the hunted. Detective Rhodes, normally the embodiment of calm under pressure, started to feel it too. The tension was suffocating. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching him, that someone, somewhere, was waiting for him to make a mistake. He'd been through too many cases where the killer was always one step ahead, but this was different. This killer wasn't just ahead, they were invisible. The dread was subtle but growing. Was it time to be afraid? The department was crumbling under the weight of the investigation. Officers, once eager to find the perpetrator, now began pulling back. They were scared. They were losing faith in their ability to solve the case. The only thing they were certain of was that they were not dealing with a random vigilante, they were dealing with a personal vendetta. The killer wasn't just picking targets at random, they were targeting those who had wronged them. The fear among the cops was palpable. Every time an officer got in their car, they thought, will I make it home tonight? One morning, Detective Rhodes arrived at work to find an unmarked envelope on his desk. Inside, there was a single photo of the most recent murder, Officer Drake, lying lifeless in his hotel room. It was a simple picture, but what made it unsettling was the fact that someone had taken the time to place a piece of paper underneath Drake's body, with the words "Next" written in red ink. The photo was unsigned. But the message was clear. The killer was watching them. The message was a game, and they were the players, but they didn't know the rules. The photo spread like wildfire through the precinct, and that was the moment when things started to fall apart. The officers who had been assigned to work the case started withdrawing. Some began calling in sick, others simply disappeared, refusing to come to work. Whispers spread through the department like wildfire. What if the killer was one of us? The fear was mounting. How could they catch someone who was so careful, so precise? How could they fight an invisible enemy? Rhodes's team started to fracture. His best officers were too afraid to take risks, too afraid to leave the safety of their homes. Detective Rhodes began to grow obsessed with the idea of the killer being someone from within. It seemed impossible, but the more Rhodes dug, the more the pieces fit. The killer wasn't just picking random officers, they were targeting those with direct ties to Nia's death. The killer was not an outsider. They were part of the system. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The killer was a family member of one of the victims, someone who had been hurt by the same system, someone who had seen the corruption up close, someone who had the motive and the ability to carry out these attacks without leaving a trace. As Rhodes pieced together the timeline of the murders, he realized that the killer had been watching them from the start, learning their weaknesses, finding the right moment to strike. They had no pattern to follow, no way of predicting the next move. The system, which had been designed to protect, was now being used against itself. The thought made Rhodes sick. It made him wonder how many officers he passed every day were actually involved, how many people around him could be working against him, against the very system they swore to uphold. Each new murder sent the department into further chaos. Officers started pointing fingers at one another. Trust broke down. Everyone became a suspect. The streets were filled with rumors. The police were no longer seen as the protectors. They were the ones being hunted. It wasn't just the force that was affected. The entire city felt the shift. People began to ask, who was hunting the police? The protests that had started for Nia were now transforming into a larger movement. People were starting to openly discuss the corruption within the police force, the injustices, and the officers who had walked away without facing the consequences. It felt like a reckoning was coming, but no one knew who would be the next target. Rhodes began to unravel. He was losing control, his team was falling apart, and the killer was slipping through his fingers. Every lead he chased ended in dead ends. Every time they thought they had a clue, it vanished into thin air. The more they searched, the more the killer seemed to be ahead, always one step further into the shadows. The investigation had turned into a chase for a ghost, and Rhodes knew it. He could feel the walls closing in on him. The stress, the uncertainty, the fire, it was suffocating. The question lingered in the air, who will be next? But deep down, Rhodes already knew the answer. The killer was playing a game, and it wasn't over yet. The next strike was coming, but they had no idea when, and that was the most terrifying part. The increasing paranoia and disintegration of the investigation created a sense of overwhelming suspense. Every passing day felt like another step closer to the breaking point. The officers in the department were on edge, and so was the city. Marcus's unseen hand was everywhere now, and the question wasn't whether the next officer would die, but who it would be, and when. Marcus had been planning this moment for weeks. Every step had been calculated, every move thought out. He had already dismantled the lives of the officers who had wronged him, but the final strike, this was the one that would bring everything to a head. The last of the corrupt officers, those who had directly participated in the cover-up of Nia's death, had to face the consequences of their actions. The target was Officer Edward Turner, the senior officer who had been the lead on the case from the beginning. Turner had been the one who signed off on the false reports, the one who pushed for Nia's death to be buried under a blanket of lies. Marcus had been waiting for this moment, knowing that Turner was the final piece of the puzzle. But this time, the stakes were higher. This wasn't just about taking one more officer down, it was about forcing the system to finally listen, to hear the truth that had been buried for so long. The confrontation took place on a quiet, desolate road outside the city, just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. Turner was on his way home from a long shift, unaware that Marcus was waiting for him. The air was thick with anticipation. This was the endgame, and there was no turning back now. Marcus moved like a ghost, silent and unseen, slipping into position. He had tracked Turner for days, watching his routine, learning his every movement. There was no room for error. As Turner's car approached, Marcus made his move. He was on him in seconds, pulling him from the vehicle with ruthless efficiency. Turner tried to fight back, but it was no use. Marcus had been preparing for this moment for too long. With a swift strike, he incapacitated Turner, dragging him into the nearby woods where they would have their final confrontation. Marcus didn't waste time. There was no more anger, only a cold, determined focus. He had one goal: to make Turner face the truth. He secured Turner to a nearby tree, his movements deliberate and controlled. Turner struggled, his voice rising in panic, but Marcus remained calm, pulling a small recorder from his pocket. This wasn't just about killing him, it was about making Turner confess. "You're going to tell the world what you did," Marcus said, his voice cold, his eyes unwavering. For the first time, Turner seemed to realize the gravity of the situation. His eyes widened, his throat dry, as he began to stammer. I didn't mean for it to happen like this. We didn't mean to kill her." But Marcus wasn't interested in excuses. He demanded the truth. In that moment, Turner broke. He confessed to everything: the cover-up, the manipulation of evidence, the lies that had been told to protect the system. He admitted to denying Marcus's daughter the medical help she needed, to watching as Naya's life slipped away, all to protect the department. He gave names, he gave dates, he revealed everything: the conspiracy that had kept the truth hidden for so long. Turner's voice cracked as he spoke, the weight of his guilt finally crashing down on him. Marcus listened, his expression unreadable. This was it. The truth had finally been spoken, but it wouldn't bring Naya back. It wouldn't bring the justice Marcus had craved for so long, but it would be enough. The world would know, and the world would listen. As Turner's confession echoed through the woods, Marcus's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, seeing a message from Dr. Naomi Brooks, the medical examiner who had been complicit in the cover-up. Marcus had known that Dr. Brooks had been struggling with the weight of the truth. He had expected this moment, but he hadn't expected it to come like this. Dr. Brooks had reached out, this time publicly. Her confession had been recorded and sent to the media, and the story began to spread like wildfire. Dr. Brooks revealed everything: the corruption, the lies, and the real cause of Nia's death. She spoke about the pressure she had felt to alter the autopsy report, the fear she had of going against the department. She confessed that she had allowed Nia's death to be swept under the rug because she was afraid of the system, afraid of the power the police had over her career. As the media picked up the story, the truth was finally out in the open. Marcus's actions had forced the system to confront the monster it had created. The media began to investigate the department's ties to the corruption, and the public's outrage grew. The protests that had started in the wake of Nia's death now took on a new urgency. This was no longer just about one man seeking vengeance. It was about a larger movement, a demand for accountability, a demand for justice in a system that had failed Nia and countless others. News anchors were on air, their faces grim as they reported the confession. Dr. Naomi Brooks has come forward, exposing the truth behind the tragic death of Nia King, the young girl who died at the hands of corrupt officers. The full extent of the cover-up has now been revealed, and those responsible will no longer be able to hide. The confession sparked national outrage. For the first time, people were hearing the truth about what had happened, about how the system had protected the officers who had killed an innocent child. And the entire police department was on edge, knowing that the truth was out, that their lies had been exposed for the world to see. As the final pieces of the puzzle came together, Marcus stood over the broken body of Officer Turner, the confession still ringing in his ears. The killer had won, not because he had killed, but because he had forced the system to reveal its darkness. And with that, the last piece of Marcus's mission had been fulfilled. His daughter's death had sparked a reckoning, and now, the world would finally know the truth. Marcus stood in the dim light of the alley, his breath steady as he looked at the body of Officer Turner, who had once been the face of the system's corruption. The confession had been recorded, the truth had been heard. The officers who had wronged him and his daughter were gone. Justice had been served, but there was no satisfaction in Marcus's heart, no peace, no sense of victory. As Marcus stood there, his eyes glazed over, the weight of what he had done pressed heavily on his chest. His vengeance was complete, but it came at a cost. The officers who had stolen Nia's life were gone, but the system that allowed their actions to happen still stood, unchallenged. The same system that had failed him, that had allowed a child to die in the backseat of a car while the world turned a blind eye. That system was still in place, still breathing, still in control. He realized then that there would be no real justice not until the system was dismantled, piece by piece. The faces of the officers were gone, but their actions were the product of a system built on corruption and privilege. Marcus had avenged his daughter, yes, but his revenge had not brought back the world he had lost. It hadn't undone the pain. It hadn't erased the scars that would never fade. As he walked away from the body of Officer Turner, the reality of the situation settled in. His fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. He couldn't stop now. The protests continued, but they were no longer just for Naya. The voices that had once cried out for her justice now cried out for something greater. The message had shifted. What had begun as a movement for one little girl had grown into a full-fledged fight for a broken system. People rallied not just for Naya's life, but for the lives of everyone who had been silenced. For every injustice that had gone unchecked for years. It was no longer just about Marcus avenging his daughter, it was about changing the system that allowed her death to happen. It was about dismantling the structures that protected the corrupt and crushed the innocent. The crowd that gathered in the streets no longer shouted for one life, they shouted for an entire movement, for the eradication of the system that had failed Nia, Marcus, and countless others like them. The voices grew louder. The protests didn't just echo in the streets, they reverberated across the country. What started as a citywide rally turned into a nationwide call for reform. The chants of justice for Naya became justice for all, as the message spread across state lines, and into the hearts of people who had felt ignored, oppressed, and unheard for too long. The people, the community that had once been passive bystanders, were now on the front lines. They had been awakened, stirred by the tragic events of Nia's death, and now they were demanding change. It wasn't enough to just protest for one life, it wasn't enough to just hold a few corrupt officers accountable. The entire system needed to be rebuilt from the ground up, and the public, united, was ready to fight for it. The community's role had shifted. The protests became more organized, more strategic. People were no longer just rallying against one event, one injustice. They were rallying for a future where the system could no longer be manipulated, where people of color didn't have to fear for their lives at the hands of the very people who swore to protect them. A pivotal moment occurred when the mural of Nia was completed. It had started as a simple tribute, a painting of her face, her innocent eyes staring out over the street. But now, the mural had become something much more. The words, "She deserved to breathe," were still visible, etched forever into the fabric of the city, but now they were framed by the voices of those fighting for the future, not just the past. The mural was no longer just a tribute to a lost child, it was a symbol of resistance, of the demand for change. Nia's face became the face of the movement, her name became the rallying cry, but the fight wasn't just for her, it was for the future of every child, every citizen who had been wronged by the very institutions that were meant to protect them. The mural had become a beacon of hope for those who had been disenfranchised. It stood as a reminder that the fight wasn't over. Nia's death had sparked a revolution, a movement that was determined to change the system that had taken so much from so many. The city, the people, they were no longer waiting for change. They were creating it, and it was beginning to take root, spreading further and further as the movement gained momentum. Marcus had set out for revenge, but what he had sparked was something far bigger than he had ever imagined. The justice he sought had been the first step, but it was now up to the people to finish the work, to continue the fight, and to bring about the change that Marcus and Nia had started. As Marcus stood before the mural, his heart heavy, he realized that he had given the people the courage to speak, to fight, and to demand the change that they had long been denied. And even though his personal battle had come to an end, the fight for justice, the fight for a broken system, was just beginning.